The City of Johannesburg Public Safety MMC, Dr. Tshwaku, has defended the joint operation that the South African Police Service had to restrict alcohol sales and entertainment venues in the central business district of Johannesburg, on New Year's Eve. Now, Tshwaku said the move was aimed at reducing alcohol-induced incidents and improve safety. Now, according to a report by Pace Recovery Centre, easy access to alcohol fuels violent and reckless behavior. Let's take a look at what South Africa's alcohol consumption patterns look like and whether restrictions would be a substantial measure to curb crime in hotspots. Peter Tshwaku is the CEO at the Tobacco, Alcohol and Gambling Advisory Advocacy and Action Group. Peter, thank you so much for the time this morning. Appreciate it. Did this help? Does this help? Should we be cutting off how much alcohol is taken by everybody, particularly on celebratory days?
Well, first of all, there is no question. Alcohol does fuel many negative things in our life. It interrupts family behavior. It leads to spousal and child abuse, and it does increase the crime rates. But we need to look at this particular incident, and I do not carry a flag for the sale of alcohol through taverns or anything else. The truth is that taverns are well recorded as having violated the legislation in selling to underage children. We know of incidents not so long ago where some children were killed in a tavern. We know that they allow smoking in contravention of the tobacco control legislation. So I don't carry a flag for them. In my opinion, alcohol consumption should be zero. However, let's look at this particular incident. First of all, the horse is bolted. It's too late to talk about it, but I think that the MEC should be taken to task because I think he has acted illegally and illegitimately. To begin with, the tavern owners, for whom I repeat, I do not carry a flag, the tavern owners have trading licenses and liquor licenses which specify their trading hours. If they don't comply with any other legislation, they still have a license to trade. If the MEC, on his own decision, wants to curb the trading hours, I think that he is doing so illegally. That's one thing. The other thing is that we need to take into account, as I recall, it was said that he is aiming at black tavern owners in the CBD. That is without question a racist comment. And for that, the MEC should be taken to the Human Rights Commission. But I get back to the alcohol consumption. It is bad. The best level of alcohol consumption is zero. That's the best for health, for crime, for protection of families, and everything else.
So let me ask you this then, Peter. Like you said, all of these, whether they be taverns, I'm not really sure if the MMC actually made note specifically of black taverns, but just made note of taverns themselves. Then, of course, they could be owned by anybody for that matter, just as a clarity on that part. But we'd have to just relook at that. But also, if they do have these licenses in place, then should there be a reprisal right now then? Because there surely has to be some sort of middle ground at some point that can be reached. To say then that 6 o'clock is the time, particularly then announcing it on the day, surely that in itself is also problematic, but at the same time trying to aid and help at the same time. Because we can't say two things out of the same mouth, surely, because then that's just not helping the situation either.
I repeat, I think that the tavern owners, bars, whatever you want to call them, have licenses for trading and they have liquor licenses. It's not possible for the MEC to make an arbitrary decision to restrict their trading hours. If the MEC and the SAPS suspect or anticipate that there might be problems, then they must increase security. It's their job to keep residents and citizens and people and businesses in this country safe at all times. It's not their right, in my opinion, to restrict trading hours.
So could, however, government change the rules then? Change the law and ultimately change what is provided for within those licenses? Because ultimately, the owner of those licenses or the ones that distribute those licenses can determine, however, how those licenses are then used, surely, or not?
Yes, the government can change the legislation. Until such time as they do, existing licenses and legislation apply. But you can go through a parliamentary process, print a bill, publish a bill, go through public hearings and the normal procedures, and ultimately Parliament and the other House of provinces can make recommendations to the president, can be approved, and the president can sign it into law. But until that's done, the existing law applies. For me, that's a very simple conclusion.
One could say, though, that that is what the law applies to, and they're a conduit of government, ultimately allowing them to change the law. That's one. Two, they then did deploy police in and around the area, which goes to your second point, which is to keep people safe as well. And we've also learned this through COVID-19, that if you were able to restrict the amount of alcohol usage and consumption in the country, it changed behavior.
Well, first of all, they can't act without the law having been first changed. The current legislation and licenses apply. When it comes to COVID, they did that, as I recall, under different legislation. And you and I at our home don't have any licenses or restricted trading because we're not trading. We're just living our lives as citizens. Then the government made restrictions according to other emergency legislation. And that has nothing to do with whatever other licenses we have. And I believe erroneously or correctly, the government applied those restrictions and then required vaccinations and all the other things that came with COVID restrictions. When that was lifted, they required what they called social distancing, which I must say was entirely wrong. And I wrote to them, it's not social distancing. In fact, what we want is social cohesion. What they really meant and what they should have said was physical distancing.
Yeah, and I suppose the terms, the terminology then could have been worked on. But, you know, this was a pandemic that came just out of the blue, and a lot of aspects would need to have been relooked and the like as well. Peter, what's the solution here? We're trying to create a safer environment. We're trying to, if one can, contextualizes how much alcohol South Africa consumes and then relates that back as well to the amount of gender-based violence we have in the country, criminal activity of any kind that we have in the country, there's a correlation. So we're trying to limit that while also policing and keeping safe the rest of our citizens. How do we do that best then, in your mind, as the Tobacco and Alcohol and Gambling Advisory Advocacy Group?
Well, we must consider that the government has an obligation to protect all its citizens and people in the country, even if they're tourists. So they have to comply with and meet the requirements of that obligation, protect the citizens. What they can do is change the legislation. They can restrict trading hours if they want to. It goes through the processes, as I've mentioned, and then reduce crime and reduce gender-based violence. As I said earlier, the only safe level of consumption.
Peter,
yes.
I need to interject there, unfortunately, and I need to say, at which point do we then as consumers, do we then as everyday citizens start taking responsibility for our actions then? Because it's easy enough for us to continue to blame government for something like this, and I agree that if you want to change the rules, change the legislation, etc. But at some point, surely we need to take responsibility, whether we're selling it or buying it.
Oh, there's absolutely no question. We as individuals have responsibility ourselves. It's our duty and obligation to protect ourselves, our family, our communities, and society at large. We have that obligation in terms of the Constitution. We are obliged in terms of the Constitution not only to exercise our rights, but to protect others in the exercising of their rights. So we do have a personal, social responsibility as individuals and as groups and communities. I agree with you 100%. And that should be applied. Perhaps we need to look at the government reducing alcohol consumption or blood alcohol levels or breath alcohol levels as they have done for driving. Perhaps they should do that for citizens in general. So it's not okay to be drunk in public, even if you're not driving a motor vehicle. So considering that as an introduction, and then individuals have responsibility to ensure that whether they're driving or not, they don't go beyond any limits which are set by government. That would be a good idea. And I go back to the original basis that because alcohol is a dangerous cancer-causing drug and alcohol is addictive, the real safe level, the only safe level of alcohol consumption is 0. Now, we might not get there, but that's the absolute truth, scientifically true, that the only safe level of consumption of alcohol is 0.
Yeah.
But bearing in mind the history and how we've lived, the government should consider perhaps levels of alcohol consumption, of blood alcohol levels for people in general, in addition to the driving levels. And when it comes to driving, again, I believe that the blood alcohol consumption or breath levels of alcohol consumption when you do a breathalyzer should be 0. Not at the moment it's 0.05, I think. And for breath, I think it's 0.14. It should be 0, 0 at all times. If you're driving a motor vehicle, 0. If you're not driving a motor vehicle, let government consider, with consultation of research and experts, at what level to set that.
Yeah.
So we don't get people who are out of control, beat up their wives, beat up their spouses, beat up their children. That, under any level, is not acceptable and is against the Constitution. Very simple.
Yeah. Peter, it's an intriguing discussion. I think one that government needs to have a full-on discussion about as well, because there are certainly pros and cons to this. A lot of people responsible as well who need to take account as well. Really appreciate your engagement on this one. Hopefully we can do it again. The CEO at the Tobacco, Alcohol and Gambling Advisory Advocacy and Action Group, the CEO there, Peter Uko.